My special subject talk about UK defence spending.
Who are
Crisis UK 2025.
the backbone of any kind of military effort. And I think what really stood out, and to be fair, a lot of this we did know in advance. We'd had the sort of the
date today is
coming
the
out. But what
2nd of June, Monday morning, guys, 20 minutes to 11 a.m.
readiness to fight the wars of the future. I think that's one of the key words that really stood out this morning. The idea of moving to war fighting readiness. They think that as a society, essentially, we've been lulled into a false sense of security. And a few quotes here. He says, "It's a new era in the threats we face and a new era in security. This is a blueprint to make Britain stronger, an armour-clad nation." He talked about a strategic reserve, warfighting readiness. And I think that the idea that essentially society is being mobilised, and some of the language was really quite extraordinary. But I think the flip side of it is that we're still only talking about 2.5% of GDP. Now, this isn't to make any value judgment, this isn't to say that we should spend more, but military experts say that if you want to, many of them do, certainly we've heard that this morning, if you want to achieve the sort of ambitions that he's talking about, well, that level is probably not going to be enough. It was interesting,
Chris Mason,
the political editor, did say to him, "Are you sure you can commit to all this with that money?" He said 100%, but I think there are others that may doubt that.
Well, NATO and Donald Trump want to see more being spent.
Yeah, they want to see 3.5%. There's a suggestion that in the next NATO meetings in a couple of weeks or so, they're going to call for 3.5%, with another 1.5% spent on other sort of defence adjacent things, some national, domestic national security, that kind of thing.
That's our trifling weapon, guys.
Jonathan Beale, our defence correspondent, was asking a Baltics defence minister, I believe they were, about 2.5%, 3%, and they said that's old news. So the level that we're looking to get to, 2.5%, is being dismissed by NATO allies, by some of them, as not nearly enough.
We've heard the Prime Minister say that we cannot ignore the threat from Russia, and then later on in that speech, when he was answering questions,
I thought our prisoners are more important.
He talked about
security and safety
with regard to the far north, the Nordic states. I mean, so we're talking about a new threat over and above that we've already seen in Ukraine.
Yeah, and there is a lot of talk. We saw this from the chief of the German defence staff a couple of days ago, saying that they think that within a couple of years' time, within 3 years' time or so, 3 or 4 years' time, we could see another Russian attack. There's a suggestion, there's intelligence, in fact I've been briefed this by another European defence official, that the Russians are producing more tanks than they're sending to the front lines. They are building up a strategic reserves of armoured vehicles and of tanks to allow them to do some sort of other military action. Now the reason this matters, the context to all of this, it's not, they think, that they're going to try and sweep through Europe and take a large number of countries. It's about taking little nibbles, little bites out of, for example, a country like Estonia or Lithuania, testing the resolve of NATO. And why this all matters is it's not only President Putin as a world leader who ran throughout this strategic defence review and all these conversations. The name that wasn't mentioned, but really we need to bear in mind at all times, is that of Donald Trump.
Oh.
Because there's always been an assumption, in fact that was what a lot of strategic defence policy was based on. There was an assumption that, frankly, push came to shove, the Americans would ride to the rescue. This huge military power that could sweep all before it. That assumption does not stand up anymore. We heard Pete Hegseth, the Defence Secretary, the new Defence Secretary, come in and be very, very scathing about their European allies, about basically calling European countries freeloaders. The idea that Article 5, which is the part of the NATO founding treaty that says that an attack on one is an attack on all, the idea that if Russia took a nibble out of a Baltic country, the Americans would come riding to the rescue, I don't think they can make that assumption anymore. And that is what runs throughout all of this.
That would be the text, Joe. Thank you very much, Joe Inwood. Let's speak to our chief political correspondent, Henry Zeffman, and we heard over and over there in the questions from the gathered reporters and political editors, Henry, that question about whether 2.5% of GDP is enough.
So I don't think it is enough, really.
There, the conversation is already moving, at least internationally, not just from 3%, which a lot of the questions at this press conference were about whether the UK is committed to hitting 3% of national income spending on defence by 2034, or merely hopes to. But actually that conversation is moving to 3.5%. And I think what all of this semantics and what all of this kind of game of number wang underscores is that defence spending is only on one path in the UK, and that path is upwards. And I don't think anyone in any major party believes otherwise. And that does mean that political questions will start to bite before long, especially in an environment of relatively sluggish growth, which is, if defence spending is being prioritised, then what is this government going to deprioritise in order to pay for it?
Yeah, next
His emphasis was on how this is going to generate what he called the defence dividend.
They're going to pick on the building industry.
There will be innovation and there will be jobs as a consequence of it.
Yeah, and I think Joe was exactly right to say that it was striking that the Prime Minister made this speech surrounded by factory workers rather than military personnel. If you speak to people at the top of this government, they spend an awful lot of time, of course, thinking about defence, thinking about security, thinking about geopolitics. You know, any Prime Minister does, but this one, at this moment in global history, especially so. But they also know that when it comes to electoral politics, domestic politics here in the UK, people are much more focused on the economy, or indeed much more focused on their individual cost of living, their individual economic and financial situation. And that, I think, is why the Prime Minister is trying to make this strategic defence review actually really a story about boosting jobs, boosting growth here in the UK, because that is how he's trying to tie some of those quite abstract questions about international diplomacy and international security to very concrete day-to-day considerations for the people he needs to vote for him at the next general election, even if that may be 4 or
3
so
years away. Yeah.
Henry, for the moment, thank you. Henry Zeffman, our chief political correspondent.
They might not like him much, but at the end of the day,
Around the world and
safety,
across the UK,
security is very
this
important.
BBC News.
I go 3.5%. Please splash on side German. Safety for our country is more important.